Boston was a city that rarely paused. It rushed through its seasons with a kind of elegant urgency snow melting into cherry blossoms, summer heat bleeding into amber-colored fall. But inside the walls of St. Gabriel's Medical Center, time didn't bend to nature. It pulsed to a different rhythm. Trauma pages, heart monitors, scalpel cuts, lived suspended in the space between breath and steel. Dr. Liana Brooks moved through that rhythm like she had been born inside it. Her name carried weight at St. Gabriel's, because of her pedigree or charm, but because she delivered every single time. She was the one who didn't flinch when a 12-hour surgery turned into 15. The one who held her scalpel with the precision of a concert violinist. The one who stayed behind after everyone left, not for praise, not for promotions, but because excellence was non-negotiable. She wasn't just brilliant, she was unrelenting. At 33, Liana had already made senior trauma surgeon in one of the country's most competitive private hospitals. No silver spoon had fed her journey there. She had grown up in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in South Boston. Her mother worked nights at a diner, her father long gone before she could walk. She knew what it was to live by rationed groceries. You've shared textbooks, and the kind of silence that comes from being too tired to talk at the dinner table. By the time she graduated from Harvard Medical School, she had built an armor around herself, flawless, impenetrable. She didn't let people in, not really, not ever. Love to Liana was a myth sold to women as a distraction. She didn't have time to be distracted, which is why she noticed immediately when Damien Hale arrived. He didn't belong in a hospital, at least not in her definition of one. He walked through corridors like they were boardrooms, made eye contact like he was signing acquisition contracts, and smiled with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no and meant it. Damien wasn't there to treat patients. He was there to profit from them. After his father's death, Damien had inherited Hale MedTech, an empire of healthcare properties, research labs, and private clinics that stretched across 3 continents. Under his leadership, profits soared, operational costs dropped, and hospitals were absorbed into sleek, modern hubs of clinical efficiency. But something vital disappeared in the process, something human. Liana had sensed that immediately. Their first confrontation took place in the hospital boardroom, a modern space with glass walls and matte black accents too sterile for its own good. He was there to present his proposed restructuring plan for St. Gabriel's, complete with digital flowcharts and ROI projections. She was there, reluctantly, as the voice of the medical staff. By introducing a high-efficiency surgical model, Damien had said, pointer gliding across a smart board, we reduce average or time by 22%, minimize staffing redundancies, and optimize billing cycles. These adjustments positioned St. Gabriel's as a flagship for next-gen hospital management. He was polished, rehearsed, perfect, and Liana couldn't stand him. She raised her hand slowly, her tone as measured as her incisions. Where in this model do you account for the 65-year-old woman with no family, no insurance, and a tumor that requires 10 hours in a multidisciplinary team? Damien had paused only a moment. We triage based on viability and return on investment. Resources are not infinite. Dr. Brooks, we have to make decisions. Her gaze sharpened. Patients are not portfolios, Mr. Hale. They're people. They're people. Room grew quiet. Some of the board members glanced at one another, nervously adjusting ties. But Damien merely tilted his head and smiled, as though amused. And people, doctor, deserve hospitals that can afford to exist. From that day forward, the war began. They butted heads in every policy meeting. She fought for patient-first ethics. He countered with efficiency metrics. She insisted on keeping programs that lost money but saved lives. He redlined them from the budget. What should have been professional disagreement turned personal, yet, what disturbed Liana most wasn't his coldness, it was how much of her attention he occupied. She'd see him in the cafeteria, stirring coffee like it owed him interest, and feel her pulse spike. She'd overhear his voice in a corridor and tense without knowing why. And sometimes, though she would never admit it, aloud she wondered what he saw when he looked at her, because he did look, not just with curiosity, with something else, something she couldn't place and didn't want to. But she saw him, too. She saw the precision in the way he chose his words, the subtle tightness in his jaw when a nurse confronted him, the flicker of something pain maybe when someone mentioned his father's legacy. It wasn't enough to make her soften, but it was enough to make her watch. In the surgical theater, she remained ice-focused, detached, but outside the OR she began to notice how the tension between them had changed. No longer clinical, no longer strictly adversarial. One afternoon, as she was reviewing a patient file near the nurse's station, Damien walked past, his shoulder brushing hers. Afternoon, Dr. Brooks, he said. She didn't look up. Mr. Hale, he stopped. You ever relax? She glanced at him. You ever care about someone you can't leverage? For a moment, he said nothing, just smiled, that infuriating half-smile of his. Then he leaned closer. Touché, he murmured. That night, Liana stayed later than usual. The auras were quiet, the halls dim. She stood by the observation deck on the 12th floor, watching the city lights flicker against the harbor. Her reflection stared back at her tired eyes, tightly wound hair, posture that begged for rest. She pressed a hand against the glass, then closed her eyes. She had built a life that required no one, and suddenly someone was disrupting it. It wasn't love. It wasn't even like it wasn't irritation, an invasion, a thread she couldn't pull loose from the weave of her routine. She tried to forget it, to forget him. But the problem with resisting someone like Damien Hale wasn't just the danger of falling. It was the terrifying thought that you already hadn't noticed when back in her apartment that night, surrounded by muted furniture and perfectly organized files. Liana poured herself a glass of water, stared at her untouched dinner, and allowed herself one truth. Damien Hale was everything she hated, and yet something about him made her feel more alive than any triumph in surgery ever had. It was unacceptable, which is why, when an invitation arrived the next morning, a formal request to attend the Hale MedTech International Medical Gala in Florence, she considered shredding it. She should have. Instead, she marked the date, and that decision, made in a rare moment of emotional static, would change everything. Florence shimmered like a dream caught between centuries. Its cobbled streets, gilded cathedrals, and amberlit alleyways made the city feel suspended in time, untouched by the urgency of the outside world. But Liana Brooks had not come for poetry. She had come because she had no choice. The Hale MedTech International Gala was a centerpiece event where CEOs, hospital directors, medical pioneers, and financial backers converged to congratulate themselves on another year of innovation. Or, as Liana saw it, another year of policy-driven compromise masquerading as progress. She wore a deep navy dress, classic, unrevealing, not an inch of vulnerability exposed. Her dark hair was swept into a low chignon, her heels barely more than utilitarian. She wasn't there to dazzle. She was there to endure. The venue was Hotel Brunelleschi, nestled in the shadow of the Duomo. Its ballroom gleamed with white marble and gold filigree, chandeliers glittering overhead like 1,000 tiny judgments. Servers moved in elegant silence, offering champagne and canapes on silver trays. A string quartet played something delicate and expensive. Liana stood near the edge of the room, her fingers loosely curled around a glass of red wine she hadn't touched. She hated these functions, the hollow laughter, the transactional handshakes, the calculated compliments. But what she hated more was the reason she couldn't seem to leave. Because across the room, standing under a halo of soft light and expensive conversation, was Damien Hale. He was unmistakable, as always, a black tuxedo tailored within an inch of perfection, his broad frame at ease among billionaires and board chairs. But it wasn't just his presence that disrupted Liana. It was the way he watched people without really revealing anything of himself. She knew that look. It was the same one she used in the operating room, cool, controlled, dissecting the moment for its utility, except when his gaze found hers, then the precision faltered. Their eyes locked across the crowd for only a second, but it was enough. Something shifted in the space between them, something silent and combustible. Liana turned away quickly, her heart thudding in defiance. She moved toward the bar, seeking escape and movement, in distance, in the promise of solitude. But before she could even order a refill, she heard the low, unmistakable drawl behind her. "Didn't take you for the gala type, Dr. Brooks." She didn't turn, not immediately. She let the words settle between them like sediment in water. Then she glanced sideways, unsurprised to find him there, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a tumbler of whiskey, eyes lit with amusement. "Trust me, I'm not," she said, her voice dry. But attendance was heavily implied. Along with the threat of professional exile, he chuckled. "You're still the most direct person in every room." She shrugged, finally facing him. "That's not a compliment in your world, is it?" "I don't know," he said, eyes narrowing just slightly. "I think it might be why you're the only one I look forward to arguing with." There was something unsettling in his tone, too close to honest. Liana looked away again, annoyed at the heat crawling up her spine. "Don't mistake disagreement for intimacy," she said quietly. He stepped closer, enough that she could smell the soft blend of cologne and Italian tobacco on his jacket. "I wouldn't dream of it." She hated that he could still make her breath catch, hated more that he seemed to know it. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the gala muffled around them like distant static. Then he gestured toward the terrace. "Walk with me." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a command either. Liana hesitated, instinct screaming to stay put, to stay safe, but her feet betrayed her. She followed him. The air outside was cooler, laced with the scent of night jasmine and ancient stone. Florence unfolded, beneath them rooftops like burnt gold, the Arno River shimmering in moonlight. They leaned against the marble balustrade in quiet. "Why do you fight me so hard?" Damien asked, not looking at her. She stared at the city. "Because you see medicine as a machine. I see it as a calling." He nodded slowly. "You think I don't care? I think you care in metrics, in margins, in headlines." A pause. "Then my father died waiting for a liver transplant. He was too old, too sick, too unimportant. So they didn't prioritize him, even though he built half the hospitals in this country." Damien's voice was even, but Liana heard the steel beneath it. "That's when I stopped believing in the system." She looked at him then, really looked. That doesn't justify replacing compassion with capitalism. No, he said, turning to meet her eyes. But it explains why I want to build something that doesn't pretend to care, it simply performs. No waiting, no delays. Just outcomes. Liana didn't answer. She couldn't, because for the first time she saw the fracture behind the polish, the wound that shaped a man. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry about your father. He nodded once. I don't say this often, but I misjudged you, Liana. Her name in his mouth did something strange to her before she could respond. Lightning flashed in the sky, followed by a low rumble. The storm had been forecast, but no one expected it so soon. The wind picked up, brushing her hair loose from its pins. Damien reached out instinctively, tucking a strand behind her ear. It was such a small gesture, but it undid her. Her breath faltered. His hand lingered for a second longer than it should have, and in that space between thunder and heartbeat something irreversible happened. He leaned in, and this time, she didn't stop him. The kiss wasn't tentative, it wasn't even gentle. It was years of denial, weeks of tension, days of pretending layered into a single, aching collision. It was a war cry disguised as surrender. She felt herself unraveling, layer by careful layer, as if her body had grown tired of pretending. And when they pulled apart, breathless, she knew nothing would ever be the same. He didn't speak, he just took her hand and led her inside. They didn't rush, they didn't speak, they simply existed room to room, stare to stare, until they reached a suite he had reserved for the week. The moment the door closed behind them, the distance shattered. Clothes fell like silence. Hands traced skin like promises no one dared voice. And in that hotel room above a city built by artists and architects, two people who had built lives of control and calculation let everything go. For Liana it was terrifying. For Damien, it was inevitable. The hours passed unnoticed, clocks irrelevant. Rain lashed the windows while inside. Warmth bloomed where there had once been only friction. In the quiet after, Liana lay beside him, heartbeat still unsteady. I shouldn't have, she whispered. Damien turned toward her, eyes unreadable. In the dark. But you did. She rose before dawn, quietly, carefully. She dressed in silence, avoiding mirrors, avoiding the truth. Damien was still asleep, one arm draped across the sheets where she had lain. She didn't leave a note. She didn't look back, because Liana Brooks didn't make mistakes, and if she did, she didn't dwell on them. She walked through the hotel lobby as the sky paled, her heels clicking like defiance against polished marble. It had been one night, it would remain just that, or so she thought. Boston's winter had lost its sting by the time March settled in, but the cold lingered just enough to keep the streets gray and the air sharp. Inside St. Gabriel's Medical Center, the warmth of artificial light and clinical routines offered a kind of controlled sanctuary, at least for most people. But not for Liana Brooks. She stood in the staff bathroom on the third floor, her white coat hanging on the hook behind the door, her hands trembling ever so slightly. The stick in her hand displayed two lines, one faint, one impossibly bold. Positive. The room seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She stared at the result as if by force of will alone she could change it. But no matter how long she stood there, the truth stared back at her. There was no mistake, no error in the test, no medical misreading. She was pregnant. She dropped onto the closed lid of the toilet, one hand gripping the edge of the sink, the other resting against her abdomen. Her mind flashed images. She had no control over Damien's touch, the way her name had sounded in his mouth. The moment she'd slipped out of his hotel room and into denial, a night she had wanted to forget had just become unforgettable. Liana prided herself on contingency. Every problem had a strategy, every obstacle a plan, but this was outside the parameters of her control. She had never imagined herself as a mother. It wasn't that she didn't believe in motherhood, she revered it, even admired it. But for herself, it had never been part of the blueprint. Her life had been built brick by brick on achievement, stability, sacrifice. She was a surgeon. She lived in scrubs and 18-hour days. Her relationships were short, sparse, and unmemorable. She hadn't even let herself entertain the thought of children, and now here it was, unplanned, uninvited, but undeniably real. She didn't cry. Liana Brooks didn't cry. Instead, she stood slowly, washed her hands with surgical precision, and slipped the test into her coat pocket before exiting the restroom with the same measured gait that had earned her a reputation for being unshakable. But inside, her world was shifting beneath her like cracked ice. The question loomed larger than the result. What now? There was no version of this where she could tell Damien. She could already picture his reaction, controlled concern, laced with cold calculation. He would offer support, yes, financial, perhaps even logistical, but love, compassion, warmth, no. He would see the pregnancy as a situation to manage, and Liana had spent her entire life avoiding the experience of being someone's situation. She needed time, she needed space, and most of all, she needed a story, one that excluded Damien Hale. The answer came 3 days later. Unannounced, over coffee. Nathan Reyes walked into the hospital cafe with a quiet confidence that hadn't changed since med school. Tall, olive, and always impeccably dressed, Nathan had been Liana's closest friend during their Harvard years. They had studied side by side, crammed for anatomy exams at 3 a.m., and once kissed at a New Year's party before laughing it off and returning to friendship as if nothing had happened. After completing his fellowship in Switzerland, Nathan had returned to Boston for a new position in cardiology at St. Gabriel's. Seeing him again smiling, warm, steady, was like being handed a lifeline just when the water was rising. They hugged briefly. "You look the same," he said, sliding into the seat across from her, "and you look like a man who's been skiing in the Alps and eating truffle pasta for the past 2 years. Both true." He grinned. She meant to make light conversation. She meant to let the moment pass, but her hands shook when she reached for her coffee. Nathan noticed. "Liana," he said quietly, "what's wrong?" She hesitated, biting the inside of her cheek. Then the words escaped her lips in a whisper so fragile, it didn't sound like a "I'm pregnant." His expression didn't change, not in the way people's usually did. No shock, no gasping. Just silence and a stillness that invited trust. "I didn't expect that," he said gently, "but okay. Do you want to talk about it?" She nodded, eyes stinging for the first time since the test. "It wasn't planned, it's complicated, and I can't let the father be part of this." Nathan didn't ask who. She was grateful. Instead, he sipped his coffee and said, "What do you need?" Liana blinked. "I'm not sure." "Well," he said, setting down his cup, "what do you want people to believe?" She didn't hesitate. "That it's yours." It came out like a dare, too blunt, too immediate, but Nathan didn't flinch. He looked at her, long and slow, as though reading between the syllables. "And would that be a lie?" "Yes," she said. "But it would protect me." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're not used to asking for help. No, you're not used to feeling out of control." She laughed once, humorless clearly. Nathan exhaled. "Then okay, I'll do it." Liana looked up sharply. "You will?" "I will." "Why?" He hesitated, then gave her the smallest, saddest smile she'd ever seen on his face. "Because you saved me more times than you know back in school. Because I've never stopped caring about you. And because I think if someone's going to stand next to you through this, it should be someone who doesn't want anything in return." She reached across the table, gripped his hand, and let herself feel the tremor of relief that rushed through her chest. Nathan kept his word. By the end of the week, rumors had started circulating that Liana and Nathan had rekindled their old flame. It didn't take long for colleagues to start congratulating them quietly, offering soft smiles and careful praise. The lie settled around her like a coat that almost fit at night. Liana would lie in bed, hand resting on the slight swell of her belly, and whisper apologies to the life growing inside her. Not because she was ashamed, but because she wasn't ready. She still worked full-time, pushing herself harder than she should have, burying herself in cases and rounds and late-night chart reviews. She refused to slow down, as if momentum could outpace reality. But reality had a way of catching up. Every time she passed Damien in the hospital corridor, her breath would hitch. He didn't seem suspicious. If anything, he seemed more distant than usual, cordial, professional, detached. It should have been a relief. One morning, they crossed paths near the cardiac wing. Damien nodded as they passed. "Dr. Brooks," he said evenly, replied with the same cool civility, "Mr. Hale." But for a flicker of a second, his gaze dropped not to her eyes, but to the subtle curve forming beneath her blouse. Something unreadable crossed his expression, and then it was gone. That night, Liana couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, one hand resting on her stomach, the other fisted around the hem of the blanket. She had made a choice, one rooted in self-preservation, one she still believed was right, but she hadn't anticipated how much it would hurt to see him look at her and not know that the baby kicked for the first time that night, a flutter, barely noticeable, like a whisper from within. She closed her eyes and whispered back, "I've got you, I promise." In the days that followed, she began to prepare. She visited a private obstetrician. She purchased a tiny apartment outside the city center. She made lists, checked insurance policies, arranged for maternity coverage that she wasn't sure she'd even take. And she continued the lie, because telling the truth, letting Damien in, would mean exposing herself to something she didn't know how to survive. The chance that he wouldn't want them, and worse, the possibility that he would. Late spring air in Boston carried a softness that made it easy to believe in renewal. The trees lining the Charles River had shed their icy burden, now stretching toward the sky in delicate green whispers. Inside St. Gabriel's Medical Center, however, renewal felt less like blooming and more like holding one's breath. Liana Brooks had become a master at that. It had been nearly 2 months since she discovered she was pregnant, and nearly that long since she began constructing the quiet, carefully guarded distance between herself and Damien Hale. She'd perfected it with surgical precision, rescheduling meetings, shifting her hours, making herself present without being accessible. It had been harder than she imagined, not just because of the logistics, but because it went against her nature. She was never evasive. She never played games. She faced things head-on, even when they hurt. But Damien was different. With him, the stakes weren't only professional or ethical. They were personal, deeply, dangerously, and now She carried the proof of their one unguarded night under her skin, a silent truth swelling slowly, beautifully, relentlessly. She was nearly 3 months along now, and her body was beginning to betray her. Nausea came in waves, fatigue followed her like a second shadow, and the once invisible curve of her belly had started to round beneath her clothes. The hospital scrubs helped conceal it, but she knew time was closing in on her. Still, she held her story, clung to it. Nathan, true to his word, remained at her side, not in the way a lover might, but in the quiet, steady presence of someone who understood the cost of a lie and still chose to bear it with her. He accompanied her to appointments, made himself visible just enough, and never asked for anything she couldn't give. There was no pressure in his glances, no expectation in his touch, just kindness and care. But sometimes kindness made her feel even more hollow, because every time she saw Nathan's gentleness, she was reminded of Damien's absence, and of the lie she had carved between them with trembling hands and cold logic. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself she was protecting the baby, her future, her peace. But late at night, when her heart beat louder than the silence in her apartment, she wasn't always sure what she was protecting anymore. One morning she stepped into the hospital cafe to find Damien already there, seated near the corner, typing something on his tablet. His suit was dark gray, crisp as always, his hair slightly tousled in the way that suggested he didn't sleep much, or that something else had begun to wear him down. She turned to walk out before he could notice, but she was a fraction too late. "Dr. Brooks," he said without looking up, "leaving without your caffeine dose, that's not like you." She froze, forced a polite smile. "Mr. Hale, I didn't see you." He looked up then, his amber eyes locking onto hers. There was a quiet weight in them, not the usual sharpness, not the usual amusement, just something still and watchful. "You've been scarce," he said. "I've been busy, busier than usual." Her jaw tightened. "The hospital doesn't run on predictable times." "No," he agreed, "but neither do people who are running from something." That struck deeper than he could have known. Or maybe he did know. Damien Hale never asked a question he didn't already have a hypothesis for. Liana stepped back, her voice low but composed. "If you're implying something, just say it." He stood slowly, slipping his tablet into his briefcase with the elegance of someone used to orchestrating chaos. "I'm not implying, I'm observing." He paused. "And what I'm observing is that something changed after Florence." "You changed?" She kept her spine straight. "I've moved on." "That's not what I asked." Silence stretched between them. Then she said the only thing that felt safe. "Some things are better left as mistakes." His eyes narrowed, and, for a second, he looked like she had struck him. But he recovered quickly, nodding once, "If that's what you need to believe." And just like that, he walked past her, leaving only the scent of citrus and steel in his wake. Liana exhaled shakily, pressing her fingers to her temple. She had said what she had to, but the ache that followed was something she hadn't braced for. Later that week, while reviewing a post-op report in the resident lounge, she heard a knock on the glass door. When she looked up, she saw Damien standing outside. Her breath caught again. She opened the door without a word. He didn't waste time. "Are you going to keep avoiding me, or are you going to admit something's wrong?" Liana blinked, startled by the raw edge in his voice. "There's nothing wrong." He stepped closer, eyes searching hers. "You've barely looked me in the eye since Florence. I ask myself if I crossed a line, if I misread something, but every time I look at you I know that's not it." Her chest tightened. "Damien." "No," he cut in, voice low but firm. "You don't get to rewrite that night like it didn't happen. Like you didn't feel what I felt." She swallowed. Her heart pounded. He leaned in, his voice nearly a whisper. "Unless you tell me to my face that I mean absolutely nothing to you, I won't stop asking." Liana looked up at him, really looked. The fire in his gaze, the vulnerability hidden behind it, the confusion, the needle of it poured into her like warm water on frozen stone. And still, she chose silence. Because the alternative was the collapse of every wall she had spent her life building. So she said the one thing that would keep him away. "I'm seeing someone." She lied. His face went still. She pushed further. "It's Nathan, we've reconnected. The baby is his." It was the cruelest line she had ever spoken. For a second, she thought he would laugh, accuse her of joking, but he didn't. His shoulders dropped slightly, the air around him shifting. His expression didn't crumble, but it dulled, as if something inside him went quiet. "I see," he said finally. Liana hated herself for how calm he sounded. She hated the way her chest screamed at her to stop, to take it back, but she stood firm. Damien nodded, took a step back, then looked at her one last time. "Congratulations," he said softly, "to both of you." And he walked away. Liana stood there long after he disappeared, her hands trembling so hard she had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. When she finally made it home that night, she collapsed onto her bed, wrapped her arms around herself and let the tears fall unchecked, not because she regretted protecting her secret, but because she knew deep down that she had broken something she could never repair. Nathan found her the next day sitting quietly in the pediatric wing, staring out the window. He sat beside her without speaking. After a moment she said, "I told him it was yours." Nathan didn't react. "I figured. I think I hurt him." "I'm sure you did." They sat in silence for a while. Then she looked at him. "Why do you stay, Nathan?" He gave her a sad smile. "Because I know what it's like to love someone who doesn't love you back." She opened her mouth, but he stopped her. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't owe me anything, but I'm here. And I'm not going to let you go through this alone." Liana closed her eyes, overwhelmed with guilt. She was running out of room in her heart to hold all the lies. And somewhere inside her, the truth had begun to grow louder than the silence. Nathan stood at the window of his office, watching the late afternoon sun cast long streaks of gold across the city skyline. He was a man who had always lived in clarity of mind, of heart, of intention. But these days he found himself caught between what he knew, what he suspected, and what he could no longer pretend not to feel. Liana was slipping not in her worker. Scalpel was still steady, her diagnoses still sharp, but in the quiet moments between her eyes carried exhaustion not even sleep could cure. Her laughter, once rare but real, had disappeared entirely. And when she looked at him, there was a guilt so heavy behind her gaze that it made him ache for her. He had agreed to the lie. He had offered himself as a shield, not a savior, but watching her shrink under the weight of her choices was beginning to feel less like loyalty and more like complicity. He couldn't keep standing still. That evening, he walked along echoing hallway to the administrative floor of St. Gabriel's, past the polished glass offices and framed certificates, until he reached the corner office with "Hail" engraved discreetly in silver on the door. He knocked once. Damien looked up from behind his desk, his expression unreadable. "Nathan," he said coolly. "2. What do I owe the visit?" "I need to talk to you," Nathan replied. Stepping inside, Damien gestured to the chair across from him. "I assume this isn't about cardiology budgets." Nathan didn't sit. He stayed standing, hands in the pockets of his white coat, the lines of his jaw tight. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I'm only telling you because she won't." Damien's gaze sharpened. "This is about Liana, yes." Silence thickened between them. "I know what she told you," Nathan continued. "About the baby, about us." Damien leaned back slightly. "She said it was yours." "It's not," Nathan said quietly. "It's yours." The words landed with the force of a freight train. Damien didn't flinch, but the air around him seemed to shatter. He stared at Nathan, unblinking, as if waiting for the punchline to a cruel joke. "She lied," he said, voice low. "She was scared," Nathan said, "of what being tied to you would mean, of what she might lose, and maybe, on some level, of what she feels." Damien stood slowly, his hands flat on the desk, the tension in his shoulders radiating like heat. "And you just went along with it?" "She asked me to," Nathan said, "and I said yes. Because I care about her. Because I thought protecting her was the right thing." Damien's mouth was a hard line. "And now I think lying to you is only breaking her more." A long pause followed. Damien turned toward the window, jaw tight, eyes narrowed against the light outside. "Where is she?" he asked. "She's at the hospital," Nathan said. "But she's not okay. Her blood pressure's been fluctuating. She's not sleeping. And I don't think she has the strength to fight anymore." Damien grabbed his coat without another word and walked out, leaving Nathan alone with the fading sun and a silence that finally felt like something honest downstairs. Liana sat alone in one of the smaller break rooms, her hands curled around a cup of tea gone cold. She was too tired to drink it, too tired to cry. Her back ached, her head pulsed, and despite the kind words from colleagues, the quiet support from Nathan, and the growing life inside her, she had never felt so alone. The door opened. She looked up and everything inside her stopped. Damien stood there, tall and still, his face carved from a storm she knew all too well. But this time there was no arrogance in his eyes. No control, no masked out, just something raw and real. He stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. She stood, heart pounding, hands trembling at her sides. "Damien, you lied to me," he said softly. "Not an accusation, not a weapon, a truth." She looked down. "I did. Why?" She lifted her gaze, and the sorrow in her expression nearly brought him to his knees. "Because I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid you'd see me and the baby as a complication. A responsibility. Not something you wanted. Just something you felt obligated to manage." He stepped closer. "Do you really think so little of me?" "I didn't think I could survive being wrong," she said. "And I didn't want to find out." Silence hung between them. Then he moved forward, gently, like one might approach something broken. He stopped just in front of her, close enough to feel her warmth, her hesitation, her fear. His eyes searched hers. "It's mine?" he asked. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. He placed a hand slowly over her abdomen. Her breath caught beneath his palm. He could feel it, the smallest flutter, like a heartbeat echoing under glass. He swallowed hard. "I should have known." "You did," she said. "You just didn't want to believe it either." He looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them said a word. It wasn't necessary. Everything unsaid had already passed between them. Then, quietly, Damien dropped to one knee, not in proposal. In reverence, he rested both hands against her belly, his forehead against her side, his voice shaking. "I would never have walked away," he said. "I would have fought. I still will." Liana cradled his head with one trembling hand. her other clutching the edge of the table to stay upright. "I didn't know how to let you in," she said. "And by the time I wanted to, it felt too late." He looked up, eyes wet. "It's not too late. It's never too late, Liana." She dropped to her knees beside him, unable to hold it together any longer. The tears came, and he caught them with his hands, with his lips, with his silence. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He held her like he never intended to let go again. Later, that night, Damien sat with her at her apartment, helping her into bed, pulling a blanket over her legs while she rested against the pillows. He watched her fall asleep, her breathing finally calm, her features softer than he had seen in weeks. In his hand, he held the first ultrasound photo Nathan had given him earlier. It wasn't just a blur on a screen, it was hope. He pressed a kiss to Liana's forehead before whispering into the quiet room, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the city lights flickered in rhythm with the life growing inside her and in Damien's heart. Something finally broke open, not in pain, but in love. The days after the truth unraveled did not unfold in a cinematic rush of reconciliation, but in the quiet, halting steps of two people learning how to breathe beside each other again. Liana sat on her balcony in Cambridge one late afternoon, sunlight drifting through the budding branches. Her tea had long gone cold beside her, but she didn't move. Her hands cradled the slight rise of her belly, now unmistakably showing beneath her sweater. She was 20 weeks and halfway through a journey she once thought she'd take alone. She hadn't seen Damien for 3 days, not because he'd disappeared. He had called, texted, sent flowers she hadn't asked for, but couldn't bring herself to throw away. He was giving her space, just as she asked. But in that space, the guilt-fermented telling the truth should have felt like liberation. Instead, it had reopened every wound she'd stitched closed with control. She had hurt him, and, in doing so, she had hurt herself. When the knock came on her door that evening, she knew it was him. She opened it slowly. Damien stood there in jeans and a navy sweater, casual, almost hesitant, like he'd been pacing her hallway for hours before knocking. "I won't stay long," he said. "I just needed to see you." She stepped aside, without speaking, motioning toward the kitchen. The apartment was dim except for the orange hue of sunset painting her windows. He moved slowly, hands in his pockets. His gaze flicked to the open folder of baby ultrasound prints lying on the table. "You kept them," he said softly. "Of course I did." He sat across from her. The silence was different now, not icy, not cold, just full of everything there. "Didn't know how to say I wanted to yell at you," he admitted. "When Nathan told me, I wanted to scream, accuse, demand answers." She nodded. "You had every right, but I didn't." He looked at her because underneath the anger I was scared. "I've spent my whole life managing hospitals, companies, disasters, but I've never felt this fragile, like the person I wanted most had stopped believing I could be good for her." She swallowed hard. "It wasn't that I didn't believe in you," she whispered. "It's that I didn't believe in being chosen." His brow furrowed. "I grew up with a father who left before I could speak his name, a mother who buried herself in 3 jobs in silence. I was raised to survive, not to expect protection or partnership." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You didn't deserve that. I told myself I was strong because I never needed anyone, but the truth is, I never gave anyone a chance to be there for me. And when you showed up, not just in Florence, but after I panicked, because I knew that if you left I wouldn't recover." His expression softened into something that ached with patience. "I'm not going anywhere, Liana, but you have to let me stay." She looked down at her hands, then back up. "I don't know how. We learn." And then quietly, vulnerably, he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. This time, she didn't pull away. The next week passed with a fragile kind of hope threading its way between them. Damien started attending her doctor's appointments. He asked questions, wrote down notes, even ordered a full ergonomic redesign of her surgical workspace to reduce strain. He did it without fanfare, without asking for thanks. He simply showed up. One afternoon, after a routine prenatal checkup, Liana turned to him in the elevator and asked, "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her. "Because this baby is part of me, and so are you." She looked away, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. "We're not together yet," he said. She blinked. "Damien, I'm not rushing you," he interrupted, gently. "But I'm also not pretending this doesn't matter. We had one night, Liana, but it never felt small, not to me." And when she looked at him again, the deflection in her eyes had started to melt. Their closeness deepened in the small things. He stocked her fridge with her pregnancy-safe favorites, left notes in her coat pocket that made her smile during long shifts, watched her fall asleep during movie nights on her couch, and never tried to press for more than what she gave. He wasn't chasing her anymore, he was walking beside her, and that, more than anything, made her heart begin to heal. Still, she hadn't told him everything. The memory of what the board had done, the vote, the betrayal still burned beneath her ribs. She hadn't told him about the 3 senior surgeons who had tried to get her removed from the thoracic rotation due to her condition, nor about the quiet warning she'd received from Dr. Malden, a mentor who had once been her fiercest advocate, now urging her to take early leave and prioritize her personal matters. She had survived medicine's cruelty before, but now, It was crueler than ever because she wasn't just fighting for her career, she was fighting for her identity. One night, as she sat curled against Damien on the couch, she finally spoke. "They want me out," she whispered. "Not permanently, just quietly, gracefully, as if I should step aside and be grateful I ever made it this far." He turned toward her slowly. She hesitated. "It's not a direct attack, just pressure. Meetings I'm no longer invited to. Rotations I'm being rotated off. I know the signs." He was silent for a long time. Then, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't want you to fix it," she said. "I wanted to be enough to fight it on my own." "You are," she looked up surprised. "You are enough," he repeated, "but this time you're not alone." He didn't make a call, didn't threaten resignations or lawsuits. Instead, the next day, he walked into the boardroom and addressed the leadership team himself, not as a CEO, but as a man whose silence would no longer shield quiet discrimination. He reminded them of Liana's performance metrics, outcomes, lowest readmission rates, near-perfect surgical accuracy. He spoke of institutional bias, of subtle sabotage, of the kind of culture that made the best women in medicine question if they belonged. And then, in front of everyone, he said, "If the child growing inside Dr. Brooks means she's less valuable in your eyes, then this hospital does not deserve either of them." Word of that speech spread faster than fire. And when Liana heard about it, she didn't cry. She sat in her office, hands shaking, and whispered, "He fought." It was the first time in her life a man had fought for her, not out of guilt or ego, but because he believed she deserved better. That night, she opened her front door to find him standing there in the rain, no umbrella, soaked to the bone. "I didn't mean to make it public," he said, "but I meant every word." She pulled him inside without a word. They stood in her hallway, water dripping from his coat, hearts pounding. Then she kissed him, not like in Florence, fueled by adrenaline and desire, but slow, certain, real. And in that moment, forgiveness wasn't something spoken, it was something felt. Not perfect, not instant, but true. The first snowfall dusted Boston like a whisper, soft, early, and unexpected. It blanketed the sidewalks and rooftops with a hush that made the city seem gentler, quieter than it really was. Inside her apartment, Liana stood barefoot near the window, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands as she stared into the pale morning. The baby had kicked 3 times before dawn, like a quiet drumbeat inside her. Her body no longer belonged to just her, it was a shared vessel now, and the weight of that was as holy as it was terrifying. Damien had left for New Haven earlier that week, a short trip to finalize the acquisition of a historic clinic that had nearly shuttered due to mismanagement. He'd invited her to come along, promised fresh air and quiet mornings by the Connecticut shore, but she'd declined. She still had patience, still had her final trimester checkups, and a part of her, though she wouldn't say it aloud, needed time to breathe without the constant pressure of being seen, even by someone she trusted. But in his absence, she missed him. Not in the desperate way that once made her build walls, but in the gentle realization that she had grown accustomed to his steadiness. She missed the way he reached for her hand in silence, the way he left books on her nightstand, the way he waited for her not to perform, not to provoke, to simply be. That afternoon, she received a call from her OBGYN, Dr. Ayers. "Your protein levels are slightly elevated," the doctor said gently. "I'd like you to come in for additional monitoring, just precautionary." Liana nodded, already slipping into her coat. She didn't panic. She had seen too many patients spiral into fear. But as she sat in the back of the cab on the way to the clinic, a dull ache began blooming behind her temples. At the hospital they ran the tests. Blood pressure, urine, protein, fetal movement. Everything looked borderline but not quite normal. "We'll keep you here for the night," Dr. Ayers said. Concern threaded through her otherwise composed tone. "We just want to make sure nothing is escalating." Liana leaned back against the stiff mattress of the observation room and tried to slow her breath. It was just precaution. She told herself this like a mantra, but something in her gut stirred. Uneasily, it wasn't just the numbers. It was her own body whispering that things weren't entirely right. She reached for her phone. Damien picked up on the first ring. "Liana," his voice, always controlled, sounded immediately alert. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Mostly. Dr. Ayers just wants to monitor me overnight." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "I'm coming back." "You don't have to, I'm already on my way." She didn't argue. She wanted him there, even if her pride hesitated to admit it. He arrived 3 hours later, his hair wind-tousled, his coat damp from melted snow. He walked into her hospital room like a storm held barely in check, then sat beside her and simply took her hand. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "I don't like seeing you here," he said at last. "I don't like being here," she murmured. He exhaled, brushing a thumb across her knuckles. "Is it preeclampsia? Not officially. Not yet. But the signs are ... building." Damien closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to will her well. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "for scaring you." He looked at her. "Liana, you are not an inconvenience. You're not a burden to carry. You're everything." Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes, unexpected, uninvited, and deeply welcome. That night, he stayed in the room with her, slept in the armchair, one hand still in hers. She watched him while he slept, his jaw unclenched, lashes casting shadows, the years of restraint falling from his face. He wasn't Damien Hale, the ruthless hospital tycoon, in that chair. He was just a man who loved her and didn't know how to protect her from the one thing he couldn't control. The following morning, her tests improved slightly, enough to go home, enough to breathe again. They took a slow drive out of the city toward the coast, where Damien had a house in New Haven, modest by his standards. Beautiful by anyone else's, it sat at the edge of a hill overlooking the water, framed by bare trees and a long wraparound porch. "Stay here until the baby comes," he told her. "Let me keep you safe." She hesitated, then nodded. He didn't say thank you. He just carried her bag inside like it was the most natural thing in the world, and over the following weeks, something shifted. Mornings were spent with her feet in warm socks, curled beside the fireplace, medical journals in her lap, and the sound of Damien making breakfast echoing from the kitchen. He read to her from news clippings. She teased him about his poor knife skills. He drove her to every appointment, argued gently with the nurse about waiting times, and filled the house with flowers he claimed were just for air quality. They became a team, not just in logistics, but in heart. The silence between them turned into comfort, not avoidance. Her laughter came more freely, and one night, while watching a documentary on endangered species, she turned to him and said, "Do you want a daughter or a son?" He smiled softly. "I want someone with your fire and your stubbornness and your ridiculous need to prove everything on your own." She smirked. "So a daughter," he nodded, but that joy was tempered by unpredictability. Her health fluctuated. Some days were calm, others brought sharp headaches and swelling ankles. The risk of preeclampsia hung in the air like a silent guest, always just at the door. And yet, Liana found herself trusting not just the medicine, not just her body, but Damien. One night, just before the baby shower Damien had secretly planned with Nathan's help, she found a small velvet box tucked beneath her pillow. Inside was a single key, and a note to the life we're building, one room at a time. She clutched it to her chest, breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a proposal, it was a promise to rebuild trust, not rush it, to stand beside her, not in front of her, to offer her a door not to cage. She walked into the living room where he stood by the window, and without a word she wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressed her cheek to his back. "I love you," she whispered. "I've loved you quietly, and slowly, and against every defense I thought I needed." He turned, took her face in both hands, and kissed her so gently it broke something open in her again. Not her walls, but the room behind them. The storm rolled in with a quiet insistence, low clouds smearing across the New Haven sky like bruises. By the time the rain started, Liana was already lying in bed, one hand on her belly, the other clutching the edge of the blanket. She was 35 weeks. The room was dim, the house unusually silent. Damien had stepped out to meet the local contractor finalizing renovations for the pediatric clinic he planned to reopen. He had asked her if she wanted to come, but she had been too tired, swollen, too dizzy to leave the comfort of their quiet sanctuary. She had barely dozed off when the first wave hit. It wasn't pain, at least, not initially. Just a tightening, low and sharp, and then a sudden shift in pressure. She sat up, breath caught in her throat. The second wave came faster, sharper, harder. She reached for her phone, but it slipped through her damp fingers and clattered to the floor. Her vision blurred. The pressure intensified. She cried out within minutes. The floor beneath her was wet. Not from the storm outside, from within. She was in labor too early, too fast. Her breath turned jagged. She crawled toward the phone, her mind struggling to focus. The call to Damien didn't go through voicemail. His number unreachable in the storm. Frustrated tears blurred her vision. She called Nathan instead. He picked up immediately. "Liana, I need help," she managed, voice strained. "It's happening. I'm on my way." It took 20 minutes for Nathan to reach her. 20 minutes that felt like an hour. She was on the living room floor, body curling around itself with each contraction, heart racing with fear and adrenaline. When he finally burst through the door, soaked to the bone, she had never been so relieved to see anyone in her life. He scooped her into his arms and helped her to the car. They drove in silence, except for her labored breathing and his calm, steady coaching. "You're doing great," he murmured, glancing at her between windshield wiper strokes. "We're almost there." Damien reached the hospital just minutes after they arrived. He had received Nathan's message at last, and when he walked into the delivery wing and saw Liana already prepped for emergency intervention, his composure broke. She was pale, exhausted, hooked up to machines and IVs. But when their eyes met, even through the pain, something unspoken passed between them. He rushed to her side and gripped her hand. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here, Liana." She gave a faint nod, too weak to speak, but her fingers tightened around his like an anchor. Then came the decision no one ever wanted to hear. Her pressure spiking, the nurse reported. "Preeclampsia confirmed. We're going to have to move quickly." Dr. Ayers looked to Liana. "We'll need to perform an emergency C-section. Are you ready?" Liana nodded again. And just like that, she was wheeled into surgery. Damien wasn't allowed in the operating room, so he paced the hallway like a man possessed. Nathan stood beside him, arms crossed, worry etched across his features. Will she be okay? Damien finally asked, his voice hollow. Nathan's jaw tightened. She's strong. But this is high risk. It felt like the world held its breath for the next 45 minutes, and then the door opened. Dr. Ayers emerged, removing her gloves. She's stable, she said. The baby's small but strong. She'll be in NICU, but we're optimistic. Damien exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Can I see her? She's still sedated, Dr. Ayers said. But yes, come. When he walked into the recovery room, Liana looked like a ghost of herself, drained, pale, beautiful, a fighter in the aftermath of battle. He approached her slowly, then sat beside her and placed her hand in his. You did it, he whispered. She's here and she's perfect. Her lips parted. He nodded. A little girl. She smiled, weakly but truly. He leaned down and kissed her temple, lingering in that moment, anchoring himself to her presence. I've never been so scared, he admitted. Me neither, but I'd do it again 1,000 times. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from pain, but from something gentler, something like peace. 2 days later, Liana was wheeled into the NICU for the first time. She stared through the glass at the incubator where their daughter lay, teeny pink, wrapped in warmth and blinking slowly under the lights. She's stronger than she looks, the nurse said gently. She gets it from her mother, Damien added. Standing behind her, Liana reached a hand toward the glass, then looked back at Damien. What should we name her? He looked at the child for a long moment. I don't know, he said honestly. What name holds this much? Liana thought of Florence the night it all began, of stormy mornings in Boston, of the key beneath her pillow, of the love that had broken through every part of her. Aurelia, she said softly. It means the golden one, light in the dark. Damien repeated the name under his breath, then smiled. Aurelia Hale. She'll never have to wonder if she was wanted. Liana reached for his hand and held it tightly. She knew. Weeks passed. Aurelia grew stronger. Liana healed. Damien transformed the New Haven house into a kind of sanctuary, not just for recovery, but for beginnings. He took leave from the hospital network, delegated leadership to a trusted crew, and built their days around skin-to-skin contact, late-night feedings, whispered lullabies, and the kind of silence that only comes from safety. One night, as they watched Aurelia sleep, in the bassinet beside their bed, Liana turned to him and asked, "What changed for you?" He looked at her, brow furrowed slightly. "You," he said. "Loving you changed everything. For once in my life, I didn't want to control the outcome, I just wanted to show up." She reached for him. "I spent so long thinking love was weakness," she said. "That needing someone meant I wasn't whole. But needing someone," he replied, "doesn't make you broken. It makes you human." And in that room, with the storm behind them and their daughter between them, they fell asleep in each other's arms. No walls, no masks, just the quiet rhythm of a family learning to breathe together. The spring sun rose over New Haven with gentle brilliance, casting gold against the window panes of the house that had once been too quiet to still. Now it pulsed with the small, sacred sounds of life, baby coos, laughter over morning coffee, and the quiet hum of two people who had finally learned how to stay. Liana stood barefoot in the kitchen. Aurelia nestled in a wrap against her chest. The baby was almost 3 months old now, small but strong. Her tiny fingers often curled around Liana's collar or a lock of her hair as if to anchor herself to the woman who had brought her into the world with blood, willpower, and love. Damien entered behind them, holding 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one without a word, kissed Aurelia's forehead, then leaned against the counter to watch them. "She looks more like you every day," he murmured. "She has your eyes," Liana countered, smiling. They stood in that silence, kind, born not from absence, but understanding. Outside, the magnolia tree Damien had planted bloomed fully for the first time. Liana had joked that it was the slowest growing thing she'd ever seen. He had replied that some things just needed the right season. And now, everything around them felt like a season finally changing. When Liana returned to the hospital 2 weeks later, it wasn't with fear, but resolve. She had debated not going back, not because she didn't love medicine, but because she was no longer willing to do it under conditions that drained her to the bone. But something in her had shifted. She had a daughter now, and that daughter would grow up watching the kind of woman her mother chose to be. She walked into the surgical wing with her head held high, the whispers of colleagues brushing past her like wind. She had nothing to prove anymore. She had only the truth to embody. Dr. Meldon approached her later that day, his face uncharacteristically soft. "You came back," he said. She looked at him evenly. "Did you expect me to vanish? I wasn't sure what you'd choose. Not after everything." "I didn't choose to return out of obligation," she said. "I chose to return because I still believe in what this place could be, but not unless it changes." He nodded slowly. "I'll support that," he said at last. "If you're willing to lead it." She blinked. "You mean?" "The board voted. You've been offered the role of Director of Cardiothoracic Development. It's yours if you want it." For a moment she couldn't speak. Then, on one condition, he raised a brow: that we rebuild the program from the inside. No more quiet sexism. No more implied expectations for female surgeons. One, policy changes, maternity protocol updates, transparency in promotions, real structural reform. His gaze was solemn. Then we do it your way. She walked out of the meeting feeling like something inside her had cracked open, not from breaking but from blooming. That night, she sat on the porch with Damien, Aurelia asleep beside them in a bassinet. He listened quietly as she told him about the promotion. "Do you want it?" he asked. She looked at the stars. Then, at him. "I want a world where Aurelia doesn't have to choose between being respected and being human." He reached for her hand. "Then we build that world." Weeks passed, then months. Aurelia grew first smiles, first babbles, first moments of stubborn refusal that made both her parents laugh through exhaustion. And in the background, Liana and Damien built something larger than schedules or titles. They built mornings that began with music instead of alarms, weekends that blended baby socks and policy drafts, love that didn't demand perfection but presence. They bought a larger home just outside New Haven, room for a garden, a guest bedroom Nathan joked he'd never used, and a sunlit studio Liana converted into a reading room. One afternoon, as she watched Damien show Aurelia how to balance a stuffed bear on her knees, something caught in her chest. It wasn't pain, it was recognition of how far they'd come. Later that night, Damien walked into their bedroom carrying a small velvet box. No candles, no grand speeches. He simply knelt beside the bed, eyes steady. "I don't need to start over," he said. "I just want to keep going with you." Liana blinked back tears. "You already have me." He opened the box anyway. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, gold, with a small stone in the center. Not flashy, not a statement, a symbol. She said yes. They married in their garden on a soft June morning, magnolia petals drifting through the air like blessings. Nathan officiated. Aurelia, in a flower-crowned white dress, slept through most of the ceremony in Liana's arms. They didn't vow to fix each other. They vowed to hold space. To listen harder, to stay. Years later, when Aurelia asked how they met, Liana laughed and said, "Your father owned the hospital I tried to quit from. He thought he could fix everything with money. I thought I didn't need anyone." Aurelia grinned. Who was right? Liana looked at Damien across the room. He met her gaze and smiled. "We both were wrong," she said, "and that's what saved us." In a world where pride often wears the mask of strength and silence disguises fear, the story of Liana and Damien reminds us of something profoundly human. That healing does not only happen in hospitals or with medicine. It happens when we dare to be vulnerable, when we allow ourselves to be seen not for the perfect image we present to the world, but for the fragile truths we hide behind closed doors. Liana, a woman forged in discipline and independence, believed that love was weakness and that needing someone meant surrendering her identity. Damien, a man wrapped in power and control, mistook logic for connection and distance for protection. Yet it was through pain, trust, and the slow unraveling of defenses that they each discovered their truest strength, not in isolation, but in choosing to stay. This is a story about redemption, not from failure, but from the fear of love, about how even two broken people, when honest enough to face their pasts and humble enough to learn from them, can create a life of quiet, enduring beauty. And that sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is let ourselves be loved. So if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own journey, your own scars, or the quiet battles you've fought, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, inspire, and remind us all. Love doesn't fix what's broken, but it gives us the courage to begin again. We can't wait to share the next story with you. Until then, stay soft, stay strong, and never stop believing in second chances. Subscribe now, and let the next story find you.